Well, what do you know? It appears that that is working, and it appears that that is working. So we are actually live in a very real sense, which is pretty nice. So now we just gotta wait around a little bit and wait for the chat room to fill up, hopefully. And we can talk a little about anime. Not anime, not anime, but that whole Japanese animation thing. Let me just see if there's any interesting news stories worth screaming and yelling about. There's almost always news stories worth screaming and yelling about, of course. Maybe not worth screaming and yelling about, but the people will scream and yell about, right? Let's see here. Yeah. English dub teaser for Mirai. That's good. But we all know we're getting that. I need to fix some audio issues on here. Getting some flickery sounds. New Shinichiro Watanabe show. That's cool. Netflix doing 3 new anime series. New Gonzo show for Netflix. Looks like an all CG anime. Altered Carbon spinoff. Pacific Rim animated series. Cool. Won't complain about that. Ultimate Cowboy Bebop edition by Anime Limited, so that'll be UK. Bit of a shame. It looks pretty cool. So let's see here. So Carol and Tuesday. Commercial. Collaborating with Gibson. So I'm assuming it's music related. Show set on Mars. Story about people actually making music instead of being generated by AI. Premiering on Plus Ultra. Interesting. Wonder how long it'll be. Watanabe tends to do 26 episode shows, so that would be fine. Kabukicho Sherlock coming. Another Sherlock Holmes adaptation. Definitely a bit of a definitely a loose adaptation. Not complaining. Looks like it has a bit of a Yakuza feel to it. East side of Shinjuku. Kabukicho. Okay, yeah. Interesting. I'm up for that. When is that premiering? Is that for the winter season? They don't say. 2019. So that'll be coming. Hey, Carl. Always interesting to see another adaptation of Sherlock. See how they approach that. Oh, another Futari H manga coming. Futari Echi. Always, one of these days I'll probably just go ahead and read Futari Echi. Considering it's one of the most popular manga ever written. Probably worth a check. What else we got? Yeah, various adaptations here and there. Paradox game. Visual by Sadamoto. Let's pull that up. Oh, pretty. Spin-off of Futari Ecchi Another. So basically same premise, more or less a reboot of Futari Ecchi. Interesting. One second, let me dig into. I'm hearing a lot of crackles from the my speakers, and I think I've got some cross wires. Let's see. Let's see if we can do anything about that. No. There we go. Cool. Just had to move some things. Wonder if... Nope, that resolves it. Sweet. I can actually hear now. That's good. See how my tea is. That's good. So I've started uploading videos from Anime USA. I've got a whole bunch coming from AUSA, various panels and interviews you'll be seeing on the YouTube channel, so that should be fun. Looking for the more educational, informational things. Hey, Game Escape, good to see you. So we've got panels with Crispin Freeman. Who else? I've actually got the list here. Monica Rial. And a few other folks on with subjects from giant robots to story and sort of myth, plus other stuff. I recorded a few panels that I did that were really rough, so I probably won't be uploading that footage just because the footage just is my presentation was not great, and in one case we weren't able to record the first like third of the panel, so that's so it was more a test of recording, but hopefully those will come up soon. But yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff to come up. So we've got Crispin Freeman stuff, a bunch of clips from his panel interview, some stuff with Jim Cummings, Monica Rial, a nearly complete history of mecha panel, a voice acting panel, a panel on American anime. So in other words, American animated series that exhibit traits of anime. So that's going to be fun and interesting. Definitely looking forward to that. Seeing what you guys think of all that stuff. And excuse me. Is this? That is that. Where are my videos? Mine. There they are. I've started playing around with. Hey, Sophronia, good to see you. I'm just getting into things here. Hikes. 190904. Just getting everything settled. More news and announcements of upcoming anime, but nothing too shocking, which is just fine. But yeah. So I wanted to talk tonight in terms of discussion topics. Hey, Russet. I wanted to talk tonight about extreme material in anime, and just kind of throw this out here because I think it's something that comes up a lot. The idea of extreme violence, extreme sexual material, extreme amounts of nudity in anime, because sometimes those seem unnecessarily excessive, and sometimes it's presented as though the show is really trying to say something with that excess. And I want to talk a bit about when a show is or feels excessive unnecessarily, and when it's really trying to say something with that particular aspect. Hey, Spin to Win, just been live about 10 minutes or so, roughly that. And because I think it is interesting how often we have these things. Let me just pull up. We had a list on the Discord. We were chatting about this throughout the week. So Fits of the North Star is one of the classic examples where people explode. Elfen Lied or Elfen Lied, a lot of nudity and gore. Gantz, same thing. Akira, more violence than sexuality or nudity. Although there is that scene in Akira of the topless girl, which is kind of there for just a fraction of a second, basically. It's there for maybe a second or two, and it just kind of seems like, well, why is that there? Like, that doesn't seem to really help. It didn't really tell us anything about the story. Also situated in a very violent scene. And of course, Goblin Slayer this season has been honestly what really pushed me to think about it, because it does have a lot of violence and sexual material in it. And people are talking about, is that reasonable or is that problematic, right? Is it there really more to titillate or more to excite people, or is there actually a point behind it? And we've had this, like I said, for decades. Berserk, Psycho-Pass, Technolize. And it's interesting because I think when you look at Akira as a great example, that is a movie where the violence is very intentional and it's pretty surgical. Akira is not violent unnecessarily. There's a lot of violence in it. Particularly the first episode of Goblin Slayer is what I'm thinking of. Akira is a story about a violent time and about violent characters, but also that violence has consequences for the characters. The violent characters then face certain effects of that attitude, and that leads them down a path, and the characters who are less violent, less so. I think that's where that violence can be interesting and can be worth throwing in. It's not just for shock value, although it is certainly shocking. And I think that's one of the reasons why Akira feels appropriate with that level of violence, because it is clearly meant to be shocking. It's not just meant to be excessive to be exciting. It's meant to make you feel kind of icky about how violent the characters are being. Right. I think Goblin Slayer is another great example. And I've only seen the first episode of Goblin Slayer so far. I intend to watch more of it. But the first episode definitely shocks you with the amount, particularly sexual material, but also the violence. It's very gritty violence in a setting that is typically not very gritty, where violence is, you stab something and then it disappears in a puff of smoke, basically. And death can be tragic, but it's not painful, and it definitely is in Goblin Slayer. So that, I think, is interesting. And Goblin Slayer is kind of in that middle ground where it is clearly meant to be shocking, but there's also a lot of that material kind of thrown at you out of nowhere. And so, and because it comes out of nowhere, it can feel kind of like a betrayal. Like, that's not what I came here for. You see the trailers for Akira, it's going to be violent. You see trailers for Goblin Slayer, and even though there is, action and people slaying goblins and such, you think what that's going to be like, because we see that a lot in media and fantasy and so forth. So to see how that's treated in the show can definitely feel inappropriate, right, in that sense. Then you get a show like Gantz, where the show is, and I've only seen a few episodes of Gantz, but the show is about violence on a fundamental level, in the sense of using violence to solve problems. But from what people have told me, it doesn't really psychoanalyze violence. It's not really about violence, the show itself. It's more a character study. And so the hyperviolence feels a bit more exploitative for Gantz. And also like the nudity and things like that just feels like it's there to be shocking, not because they are saying something about nudity or about titillization or things along those lines. And so Gantz is more about how people react to a situation, well or poorly, and that situation happens to require strong violence, right? So it's appropriate for the situation, but it can come across as unnecessarily excessive, right? So, like you say, Spin to Win, there's a refreshing honesty to Gantz about how people would actually react in the situation, and about how people are often very pragmatic about, yes, I'm going to shoot this person in the face because that's what gets me to the next place. It's what keeps me alive. But the show, from what I've read of people talking about the show, it is, it sometimes crosses the line into violence for the sake of violence, if you will, without really examining each of those moments of violence, if you will. And folks mentioned Technolize, which is interesting because I have watched all of Technolize, and Technolize is to a great extent a meditation on violence. There is some weird sexuality in Technolize, which it really isn't studied at all, and it does feel a little bit like ridiculous titillation. But Gantz does do a great job of showing a violent society and the consequences of that violence. The fact that that does cause violence to beget violence to beget violence, and without any cycle or without any change to that cycle, it just degrades into everyone killing everyone else. Good question, Russet. Do you think it's more shocking to see excessive violence or nudity in anime than it is to see in a normal Hollywood production? I think in some ways it's more shocking in anime because that level of violence and nudity is so relatively rare in anime compared to in Hollywood. In Hollywood we have a long tradition of R-rated movies, and anime just doesn't really and I think it's also shocking because it's easier to do in anime, and anime so often pulls back from that and does not go down the road of hyperviolence. So when we see it in anime, it seems kind of crazy, right? It's shocking because we feel like, well, why aren't you doing this all the time? Which is kind of interesting. It's a great way of putting it, Spin to Win, that Gantz fetishizes violence. And that's a great way of explaining where you cross the line from, hyperviolence as a theme and as a fetish, right? Right, and I don't watch Game of Thrones. I've seen clips of Game of Thrones, and the nudity in that does seem out of place to me, oddly, where you got these characters in these scenes, and it's kind of like, well, we don't need to see those breasts. Like, I know the breasts exist, and we have a long tradition of being able to show sexuality without having to show nudity, and it just seems weird that they just kind of throw that on the screen to me. Now John Wick, I think, is interesting because it does have extreme violence, but it's stylized in a way. So it's like, I'm forgetting the name of it. Ultraviolet, was it? There was a Keanu Reeves movie. I think it was Keanu Reeves movie from like 15 years ago. In some sort of Fahrenheit 451, style future, very locked down. And featuring gun fu, that whole concept there. And there was a lot of killing, but because it was so stylized, it wasn't gory necessarily. It worked because it was kind of that Hollywood style of violence, that kind of G.I. Joe violence, if you will, which is kind of interesting. But you're right. I think certainly nudity, and the interesting thing too is that anime, because anime has such a long tradition of fan service, where nudity is not really, where nudity occurs in very specific situations, and it has nothing to do with anything going on, right? You don't really get Game of Thrones style scenes in anime. You get, normal household stuff, and then a shot of a girl taking a shower, and she gets out of the shower, and like there's, it doesn't tie into anything. There's just, here's a naked girl. Compared to how nudity is often used in Hollywood movies, where even when nudity isn't really tied in, there's some tie into what's going on in the movie. It's rare to have a scene with female nudity where it's just a random shower scene. It'll at least be a girl, changing into a bathing suit, and then having a scene in the locker room. Something along those lines. So there's usually something tying in the nudity to the story, whereas anime tends to just throw it out there, which is strange. And the other weird thing is that I think about violence, Hollywood violence is rarely self-reflective. You don't see a lot of parodies of violence in Hollywood, whereas you certainly see that a lot in anime, and there's a lot of over-the-top, ridiculous, people with guns shooting at, shooting up other people, things like that, comedic violence in anime. So I think that's also just something that makes it feel different. Whereas, again, I think it's just differently handled. So yeah, you have weird shows like Technolize that are very much about those themes, and so it doesn't feel out of place. It feels, it doesn't just feel correct. It is appropriate because it is a show about violence, about loss, about those things. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's interesting to watch that space of something that's hyper-violent when it, works its way in. And I think absolutely Spin to Win, the fact that it's animated makes a difference. There's a certain, when you're looking at a real person and they get their arm chopped off, we know it's CGI, right? When an animated person gets their arm chopped off, that is still them. That is that character getting their arm chopped off. None of it's real, but there is a closer identification with the character, since everything there is happening to that character, right? And so I think it can be more shocking in animation, since everything's on the same plane, if you will. Everything is integrated into the same, not art style, but yeah, it's all happening in the same world. That definitely makes a difference. It also makes a difference with the nudity. And this is something that that anime has gotten away with for a long time. The anime industry, that anime can kind of get away with nudity because the characters aren't really real. So, showing nudity or sexuality can be done kind of as much as you want because none of the characters are actually doing anything illegal, right? And to an extent, the same thing with violence, but we have a long tradition in animation of violence, Tom and Jerry. So we don't feel that violence against animated characters is weird unless it is a very realistic show, right? Great example, Game Escape, Haruhi Mise. The scene where the main character kind of assaults the female character just feels completely out of place. And I think it's there to show that he's he is a guy who has been very polite and respectful towards this girl, and he's going through a lot of stress, and he just kind of suddenly snaps. And as soon as she knocks him out, he completely backs off. But it's, it feels completely out of place because it is such a 0 to 100 reaction. And it really feels like that visual, or that scene, because he does rip her shirt off. It feels like an excuse to throw in some boobs, right? It feels like very, very clumsy fan service that they tried to work into the plot. It's almost like they had to have a topless scene in there, but they felt a need to write it into the plot, but it feels completely wrong. You're absolutely right, Russ, and that's a cultural thing too, right? It is very rare to see sex scenes in live action Asian cinema or TV shows as well. It's just not and it's not because Asians are prudes. It's because that's just not been a feature of their cinema, unless it's a pink film or other more adult film. Pink films are essentially like light, or they're R-rated movies like the 60s and 70s, which would often have highly sexual, highly violent elements, but would not show it on screen, right? So if someone's being sexually assaulted, everyone would have their clothes on, for example, right? Or if otherwise people were having, were getting it on, they would be clothed, and they would just be showing you rubbing up against each other or whatever. Or someone would, slice someone with a sword, and we'd cut away before the sword hits anything, and we just see a splash of blood and cut away. So there were a lot of those, and they had a lot of hypersexuality and hyperviolence, but cut in a way that they didn't show anything, which is a whole other interesting element, where you can absolutely have these elements without actually having them on screen. The pink films can be really... I've seen some stuff in pink films that would shock the average hentai viewer. Just stuff that was mind-blowing that they could get away with because they didn't actually show it. They just had people talking about it and kind of mime it, if you will. So it can get weird. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's why you have that weird division where we have very little in the way of sexuality in anime, but lots and lots of nudity. And I think that's where they kind of shift it, right? Where instead of attacking, or instead of including sexuality directly, we always take that left turn into anime. Spenderman says, bothered by how masculinity is portrayed in some anime. I'm curious to see what you think, where you're going with that, Spin. I too have issues with that, but I'm curious where you're going with it. And part of the problem with this too, especially with more recent shows, is that there's been a trope over the past 10, 15, 20 years with like slice of life shows and the romantic shows to have a mild male protagonist where, because you're doing a dating sim, excuse me, the the protagonist has to be because the protagonist has to be a stand-in for the viewer. They can't be too wild or extreme or different, right? They have to kind of fade into the background so that the viewer can place themselves in that person's shoes. And so the male character tends to be passive and uninteresting. And that can have problems with how, women are treated in shows, where the protagonist doesn't really do anything to protect them or to, speak up for them if bad things happen to them. And that can be problematic as well. I have seen some of GTO. I've seen a few episodes here and there. I think the first 2 or 3 episodes, and then 1 or 2, I think, throughout the rest of the series, of the original anime run. For those not familiar, GTO, Great Teacher Onizuka, is a series about a young man who was basically a gang member who decides to teach a high school class, a really rough high school class, and so he sort of brings his rough and tumble attitude towards the class and is very unforgiving and very rough with them, but in so doing kind of brings them around and teaches them to not be such punks. It's kind of a punk teaching punks how to not be punks, if you will. Okay, fair enough, Spin. I mean, I had problems with GTO just from what I saw. There are moments where I was like, that's, like, I understand where they're going with it, but I'm a little uncomfortable with the implications of it. And it might have just been, you know, my own weirdness with it. But there were moments where I was like, whew, they're going somewhere with that. Wow. Definitely some sexuality in GTO. Other folks mentioned Devilman, Genocyber, Higurashi, Corpse Party. Higurashi definitely. What was the dating sim one? School Days. And I've seen, again, only bits and pieces of School Days and Higurashi. But shows which very much present as normal, everyday moe shows in both cases, really. And then throw in much darker elements partway through. And part of the problem with that is you can absolutely subvert expectations. The problem comes when you subvert expectations in ways that aren't supported by the story you're telling, right? If you tell a straight up slice of life moe story and then in the middle have a character commit suicide, but the rest of the show has nothing to do with that, then it feels like you're just being, you know, it's violence for the sake of violence. It's excessive and unnecessary. And that's why when a show will make one of these hard left turns into really dark territory, the show really has to support that. It has to be about that. Otherwise, people feel betrayed. I think one of the reasons why Madoka Magica worked so well is, for so many people, was because it wasn't just magical girl suddenly dark. It was a dark magical girl series, right? Everything wove into those themes, and so that violence fit the overall show. Were there ever instances where over-sexualized fan service ruined an otherwise enjoyable anime? Yes. Rin, Daughters of Mnemosyne. I have problems with the basic conceit of Rin anyway, but there is random fan service and sexuality in that OVA that is literally just the characters are detectives and one of their contacts owns a strip club. And so literally it will be, you know, the protagonist talking in a, in their place. We cut to a shot of half-naked girls at a strip club, and then we cut to a shot of the detectives in a back office talking to the owner of the strip club. And there's no nudity or sexuality at all in that shot. And that entire sequence is just, we had to throw in nudity here. And it's like, obviously you made this a strip club so that you could show nudity. It could be somebody involved in anything else, and it just feels ridiculous and unnecessary. Rin also has a problem that, it's not a spoiler, several of the characters in that are I forget the term, essentially it's completely immortal, meaning that if you chop their arm off, a new arm will grow. You literally cannot kill them. If you smash them under a rock, they will eventually reform over the course of minutes. And the problem is, it's an action series where the villains are constantly trying to kill the protagonists. It's like, well, but the protagonists aren't gonna die, and most of the action sequences do not include any time constraint for what's going on. So it's just like, I think they literally call it immortals. So it's not. I think like there's functional immortality and then practical immortality. So it's basically, I'm immortal until someone chops my head off, right? Where I can just kind of live forever, in that sense. But this is complete immortality. And so you have these action sequences where folks are like shooting the protagonists. I'm like, I don't care if they get shot, right? They're gonna be fine. And then somebody will rig an explosion underneath them, and there's an explosion. It's like, well, yeah, but they're gonna be fine, right? Like none of the action mattered. So that was really annoying. But yeah, the sexuality in that was just like, I could have turned my brain off and enjoyed the action for just being fun action animation, but the unnecessary fan service that had nothing to the story really just was an extra layer that really turned me off. I have seen Golden Boy, Gene, yes, all the way through the original OVA. And that's a good example of where I think it skirts the line, but it is a story about a main character who's kind of a horn dog going from part-time job to part-time job. And so there is a lot of sexuality in there, not really any violence. And a lot of like just fan service of, here's a girl in a pool swimming, and there's a lot of shots of that girl swimming and, water dripping off her body. And that that felt appropriate because it was about a character who is very much lusting after these girls and how they respond to that. And it also helped that he was he's definitely lusting after them, but he's not a rapist. So, he definitely pursues them, but if they are like, no, he doesn't sneak in their window at night, right? So, So great point, Game Escape. What are some positive examples? What are some works that I think did this well? Trying to think of good examples. Again, I think Akira, given what it's trying to do, right? It's definitely not your typical action movie. And I think that certainly the violence in Akira sometimes does go to an unnecessary extreme, but that's just taste, I think. To me, Gunbusters is an example of where the fan service really felt unnecessary. There's a long sequence in the middle of that with the girls in the bath that just doesn't really add anything to the storyline and felt very much like the girls could be anywhere else. Let me think here. Bubblegum Crisis. I'm trying to remember any fan service in Bubblegum Crisis. I'm sure there was some, but I can't remember. I mean, the girls are in lingerie every so often. There's certainly that. Let me think. Gosh. Certainly violence in Bubblegum Crisis. I think Bubblegum Crisis is a great example of violence intermingled with those things. Partly because what they're fighting are these mutated androids, which is very much the theme of the show. The technology is run amok. And then when they're when they're blowing things up and destroying these things and they're exploding and it feels very appropriate to the situation where humanity has to go to these extreme lengths to rein in this technology that's gone out of control. So I think that worked for me. Kill la Kill. I have not seen enough of Kill la Kill because the sexuality did absolutely turn me off. The ridiculous outfits was silly. Were silly and were clearly fan service. And I know this, there is a plot point around that, but I absolutely believe that plot point is an excuse for fan service. So, yeah, Kill la Kill to me did feel like over-sexualization to a point where it detracted from the show. Especially because it's there right in the middle of things. Okay, so maybe some topless nudity in Bubblegum. It's been years since I've seen Bubblegum Crisis, so I absolutely believe you. I forgot that Mackie was a perv. I'm probably remembering 2040, the TV series, more than the OVA in terms of Mackie's character, now that I'm thinking about it. So you're right. That's funny. Oh, man. That TV series rebooted that show so well. Anyway. Actually, a show that I think has extreme levels of fan service in a way that I think is important and relevant is Agent Aika, where like every other shot is a panty shot, and like very much intentionally, like, it's a kind of just a panty shot show, and it's basically a James Bond-esque action story, very pulp, modern pulp, and because they have so much so many panty shots in it, it feels it gets exhausting. Actually, you see so many panty shots, you're kind of like, okay, just stop it, just
just I don't want to see another panty shot because it's just getting in the way of the story, and it's just so distracting. And I think that was a really clever way of foregrounding fan service and kind of showing how ridiculous it can be. So I really like that. 80s anime and hentai were the best violent examples. Not necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of hyperviolence in the 80s, but I think we also got, I want to say, more complex or more thoughtful hyperviolence in the 90s and 2000s and so forth, where we got shows that were violent, that were hyperviolent, but where the hyperviolence in the 80s felt, again, kind of tacked on, the Fist of the North Star thing, where the hyperviolence is just kind of there to be exciting, but it doesn't really add to the plot or anything. Tenjo Tenge, yep. There's a great example. I've only seen bits and pieces of that. Actually, Evan, I think, saw a good chunk of Tenjo Tenge, and he said, you have to get used to the fact that there's just going to be ridiculous constant fan service, but once you get into that mode, it kind of fades away. Like, it's just there. It's kind of part of that setting, if you will. So you tune it out in a way after a while. Certainly Senran Kagura has done that recently. I watched some of that this past season. The uncensored version of episode 1 has just kind of some random nudity as the characters get their shirts blasted off. And that's a good example where that happened, and because it's happening in the middle of a fight, while characters are being, killed off one by one, seemingly, I'm sure they're not killed off, but, these very dire fights are happening, interspersed with nudity. It felt incorrect. And indeed, there's another great example of a problematic, and I'll try to think of some more positive examples. High School of the Dead, where that is, I'll say it again, that is the most perfect zombie survival horror story I've ever seen in terms of pacing, characters, setup, all of that. Like, that's exactly how I want zombie survival horror to be done. But once or twice an episode, there will be strong fan service in the middle of a shot of, like, people being eaten by zombies. And the contrast is just too strong. I don't want to be turned on in that moment, right? It's just, it kind of ruined it for me. And I'm hesitant to recommend that show for that reason. Every time I come across a horror fan, I say, exactly that it's this perfect example of horror, but be aware. This thing kind of turned me off. So I think other good examples of hyperviolence or hypersexuality that I think works. There's a very obscure one. There's a anime movie called I'm forgetting it now. 1 second. I have it on my obscure anime panel. It's about 1 second. It's a movie about it adapts a Japanese novel about a man from, I think, Edo era Japan who has a bunch of different lovers and kind of goes from lover to lover. And it's a lovely OVA because it's not hentai, so they have to work through and present the sexuality. He absolutely has encounters with these women, but they have to do it in ways that aren't explicit, which is really, really interesting. Let's see. Conan, Genga, Tori, Magic Tree House. Is it in here? I'm sure it's in here. I just have to find it. The Sensualist. That's what it's called. And so there are shots of characters. It's very abstract. So you'll have these normally animated, normally drawn scenes of characters, on the street, walking into houses, so forth and so on. And then as they talk and as the scene progresses, the background fades away, and they're kind of talking in these abstract spaces, which implies how things are changing with them, and how their how their evening is progressing, right? And I thought that was just really clever, and a good combination of things. It's very much a story about sexual encounters, but there's no nudity, so kind of interesting. Angel Cop, yeah, certainly. Oh, Panty and Stocking, I think, is a very interesting example of this, where it is very hyper violent, it's very hypersexual, but it's so cartoony that it's inoffensive, right? I think the sexuality can be offensive at times, but it just feels like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. So the silliness disarms a lot of that, and it allows it to get away with a lot of things that you couldn't in other shows. Both Panty and Stocking are so abstract in their character designs that it's hard to get really particularly physically turned on by them, in the way that you would with a more realistically drawn girl. So I really find that fascinating. Let me pull up. Other really sexual things, not just sexual but fan servicey things that I think did that well. I'm looking now. There's not a lot. It does often feel just thrown in there, to be honest. Yeah, there's not really stuff. Infinite Revias does a good job of integrating sexual materials in ways that where if you don't know what's happening, it goes right over your head. But there's absolutely that going on, and it's dealt with very realistically, which I really appreciated. But there's no real fan service. No. Perfect Blue. Perfect Blue is the one, because it absolutely has nudity. It has a certain amount of sexuality. It has violence. It has some very strong violence. But it is a meditation on desire and on obsession, and how that can lead to strange elements of sexuality and of violence. And so that is absolutely perfectly integrated. Furikuri. Yeah, Furikuri has certainly... There's sexuality. Is there nudity in Furikuri? I don't remember any. I honestly don't remember any. There's certainly, sexuality, sexualism, if you will, with how, what's her name acts. Yeah, you're right. Perfect Blue may be the most critically acclaimed anime film. I rarely see anyone with criticisms of Perfect Blue compared to, say, Akira, Ghost in the Shell, where there are probably people who love those films, but other people just don't really appreciate it. But Perfect Blue seems to have a very high ratio of folks who love it. Yeah. It's pretty impressive. Yeah, there's no real nudity in Furikuri. But I can't think of anything really. I can't think of any nudity at all. I mean, there's maybe a shot of what's her name, like in a towel or something, but I don't recall anything significant there. Again, it's been, gosh, I watched that when it came out. That's, wow, yeah, I'm old. scroll through some others here. Anything else with... Again, I think Revolutionary Girl Utena has some of that. It deals a lot with sexuality, a little bit of violence, but it is very much about desire and about those relationships. So I think Utena does integrate those well. I've not seen Marduk Scramble. Nope. Yeah, that's all I can see that really does that much. And granted, I mean, I don't really, I don't seek out highly sexualized anime. Especially for normal watching. Just doesn't really do anything for me. Fan service, fan service, fan service. Not really. That's one of the reasons I do these solid combi is to, get the brain thinking about, well, what are some examples of this? What are things I've seen? Oh, right, the towel and boxing glove, which is a reference to Lupin the Third. That thing. And then you get into stuff like the, Mazinger, Getter Robo, those violent shows of the 70s. That's just, where, the violence is kind of robot-on-robot violence. Sometimes the characters get beat up and such. There'll be blood from the corner of the mouth. It's more violence in 70s anime sense. Oh, and then of course there was. So here's a great example of really hypersexualization would be Cutie Honey. The original Cutie Honey. I mean, she goes naked at least once an episode, and the headmistress at her school is constantly trying to capture her and tie her down and whip her. For escaping from school when she shouldn't, right? There's nothing sexual about it. The headmistress also being 70 years old, and she's constantly walking around with his whip. And Honey has a young man who's always after her, and is always kind of coming on to her, and they actually do a good job of where she, firmly but politely kind of turns him down, or is demure about his hey, that was really neat. We should get together sometime. And she's not, she doesn't get offended that he's coming on to her, but she also doesn't just jump into his arms immediately. But yeah, there's absolutely a lot of fan service in that, which does feel out of place, especially when you first start watching it. But it becomes such a part of the structure of the show. That's what she does every episode is she transforms, and that means she's naked for a little while. I think that works. One of the problems I had with the new Cutie Honey show from it was last season or the season before was that they kind of ramped up the sexuality, and it just kind of felt, again, it felt like it crossed that line where, okay, now it's just fan service for the purposes of fan service. It doesn't feel integrated into the show or what it's doing. Yeah, and I think Queen's Blade is an interesting example of a show that is so absurd with the sexuality, with the amount of fan service in it, that you can enjoy it as kind of a Monty Python-esque show almost, where it's just so ridiculous you have to laugh. They're not trying to be serious about their portrayals of women and violence and sexuality and so forth and so on. It's just this really goofy thing. Not to my taste, but I can see where folks are coming on that. Excuse me. So those are all the shows that really come to mind. I'm sure in an hour or two, I'll suddenly realize a show. I'm like, oh yeah, that'll be a great example of that. But no, not really. Nothing else. As I'm scrolling through the list of anime I've seen, nothing really immediately comes to mind. Like I said, I'm sure there are others out there. Cool. That was very interesting. Thank you all very much for throwing those ideas out there and talking about that. I think, again, this is one of those things where there's no right answer. There is no right amount of fan service. And it also depends on what you mean by fan service. I think when fan service is just random nudity, it's often ridiculous. But when fan service is sexuality or nudity in a show that is saying something about that, I always use the original Tenchi Muyo OVA as my example of fan service with a point, where they use fan service to tell you things about the characters. That's how I like to. That's what I like to see in fan service if it's going to be in there. That's a good question. I'm pretty sure there was nudity in Dirty Pair. Again, just very random fan service nudity in Dirty Pair, and certainly they're running around in metal bikinis the entire time. It's basically isn't. It is fan service much of the time to begin with. So yeah, I think you could make a case for that being constant fan service. So yeah, I think you can have a lot of violence in your show, as long as that fits the show and it's important for the show, and you're saying something about it or is otherwise integrated into your point. But when it's hyperviolent just to be hyperviolent, just because you kind of like hyperviolence and ooh, that's gonna be fun, then it can be a turnoff. Like anything else, right? Romance can be a turnoff if that's all you're doing. Cool. So I think that'll do it for us for tonight. My throat is still recovering from this Peruvian death flu. Tomorrow, starting at 2 p.m. Eastern, we will be watching what is on the schedule. Because we watched some of Aria the Animation last week, and tomorrow on Rabbit, thanks Game Escape. You guys are the cause of the great discussion, so thank you. We're going to try Barakamon tomorrow, which is supposed to be a nice, chill, laid-back kind of a show. Watch a few episodes of that tomorrow at 2 p.m. So hop by the Discord, and I will, there's a link to that on geekarchaeology.com, and I will paste a link in there to a Rabbit video chat room, or video room, and we will watch a few episodes of Barakamon tomorrow. And then next week, a laid-back camp, if all goes well. So that is the plan. Thanks, Jack Galagos. Thanks, everyone else. I hope to see you all next week. I'll have more stuff throughout the week, more drawing, more of that kind of stuff. But thank you all. Take care. Watch more anime.